Okay, I would like to extend a warm welcome to everyone. We have come today to celebrate Fadi Bardawil's new book, Revolution and Disenchantment, Arab Marxism and the Binds of Emancipation. Fadi Bardawil is an anthropologist by training and is currently assistant professor of contemporary Arab cultures in the Department of Asian and Middle East Studies at Duke University. His research investigates the international circulation of critical theory, the genealogies of post-colonial critique, and the traditions of intellectual inquiry and modalities of political engagement of contemporary Arab thinkers. He was a member of the Society of Fellows at the University of Chicago between 2011 and 2014, and the School of Social Sciences at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, 2016-2017. We have an illustrious panel of Yasmeen Diafallah, Gary Wilder, and Joan Scott, along with Cemil Aydin, to discuss Fadi's new book. Welcome to all.
Thank you, Ellen. Shall I start? Okay. Well, I'd like to thank Duke University and all the other sponsors for this great opportunity for us to launch Fadi's book online. This is an extraordinary book that is not only on Eurocentric critical theory and political anthropology, but also of global intellectual history. It is freely available, so there's also a politics of making this open to the world. So anyone who wants to download the book from Duke University Press, you can download it free of charge. The book revisits the major turning points of the 20th century political and intellectual history of the world, as well as the Middle East and Lebanon, by focusing on ideas and political engagements of Lebanese left intellectuals. The book also offers some crucial lessons from the experience of this Lebanese left to understand the politics of post-September 11 era cultural talk on Islam and the West, and the transformation of emancipatory political imagination of Arab politics in the last 10 years. I will highly recommend those of you reading the book never miss the final chapter, Coda, that also makes the book's relevance for contemporary affairs. We have a wonderful group of colleagues whose scholarship relates to the content of the book. I will introduce them one by one. They will speak about 10-15 minutes each. Then we will open the questioning to the audience. We have almost close to 200 people signed up for this event from all over the world. And I will, please type your questions at the end, and I will read the questions to Fadi after going through them. So our first panelist is Professor Joan Scott, who is a professor emerita in the School of Social Sciences at the Institute for Advanced Study. Her most recent book is On the Judgment of History. She has overseen the project while it's being written, and as you can see, Fadi thanks her for making sure that he finished the book on time. Professor Joan Scott, we would like to hear from you.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here to welcome this book into the world. I watched it take shape, and I was enormously impressed with how hard Fadi worked on it and how critical he was of his own production as it went along. And the result was well worth the time and the effort that was put into it. It's really a terrifically argued book, a difficult one, but clear. And I'm going to just read a few comments and then raise some questions. I think the book is a rigorous and astute study of left-wing Lebanese intellectuals over the course of many decades. It's not the usual group biography or conventional intellectual history, and it warms my heart that it's not conventional history in any way. Rather, Revolution and Disenchantment historicizes the notion of intellectual traditions, insisting on locating them in changing political contexts. The book deploys history, political theory, and ethnography to great effect. It's interdisciplinary in the best sense of the word and in the most rigorous sense of the word. I really like the use of translation as a theoretical tool for understanding how Marxist concepts were appropriated from European to Arab political sites, and also how they were differently translated by successive generations. And I think one of the things we might want to talk about later is the issue of translation, Fadi, and how you use that and how richly rewarding it was to use as a theoretical concept. Fadi tracks the conversations between local political activists in Lebanon and Lebanese diasporic intellectuals, mostly based in the global north, and he closely analyzes their different modes of appropriation, in that way refusing a unitary category of Arab or even Lebanese leftists. He ponders the question of why and how the secular left tradition, so powerful in the 1960s, waned in the decades that followed, and he asks why some of its most articulate spokesmen turned increasingly to liberal and Islamic precepts for political expression. For a historian especially, the book is, an impressive aspect of the book is the archive on which it's based. Fadi accumulated the usual documents, books, articles, issues of obscure journals, and supplemented them with political tracts and party minutes he managed to unearth, and with the personal collections and recollections of those 60s political intellectuals he interviewed at great length and in great depth. His readings of those interviews are especially astute, teasing out premises and implications by asking pointed questions and pushing his subjects beyond their first responses. Those interviews, I think, are the heart of the book's argument. And I'd love to hear more, Fadi, about how you formulated and pursued them, how you ultimately read them to have them yield the insights that they offer you. I couldn't help thinking when I was reading this of the interview you did with Talal Assad, in which you pushed him to reveal more than I think I've ever seen him reveal in any form of that kind. So I just wonder for you, if you talk a little bit about the interview as a tool of the kind of analysis that you offered, because it's not just oral history interviews that you did. There's something else that went on in these conversations that made them something much richer and more revealing than the standard oral history would represent. So I think Revolution and Disenchantment is a book that's going to have an important impact, not only in the field of Middle Eastern studies, but more generally on the thinking of students of politics and political action. One of the important things about it is that it refuses simple categorizations, East versus West, secular versus religious, global North versus global South, even theory versus politics. And it insists on the complexities of political and cultural identification and the fact that these are always subject to history. Political and cultural identification are not marks for life in the experience and lives of these activists or these political figures and these thinkers, but they change historically. And the notion that political and cultural identification changes with historical events is a really crucial insight. It seems it should be an obvious one, but it's absent so often from the kinds of accounts we get of political activists and political theorists. Underlying the study is an interrogation of how theory works politically on the ground. The book is not an exercise in applied theory. Fadi isn't advocating any particular theoretical approach, but rather it's a look at theory's uses and limits in a particular case with broader implications. He asks how theory is produced in action, how concrete historical events, in this case, the Lebanese civil wars, create the conditions for theoretical thinking. The book demonstrates that abstraction does not always precede action, but more often follows from it. It offers a model for analyzing the interplay of politics and theory in other situations. In his prologue, Fadi describes the book this way, and I'm going to just read you a longish quote from the book. I weave the story of revolutionary hope and disenchantment with the answers the Lebanese New Left articulated in practice to three fundamental issues that generations of Marxists worldwide have confronted and were, and we might say still are, divided by. The question, and this is, I'm continuing the quote, the question of intellectuals as the vectors or not of revolutionary theory, that's the first one. the debate around the organization as the mediator or not between theory and practice, the political party, the movement of one kind or another. And last but not least, the anxiety generated by non-emancipatory, non-class-based solidarities, attachments such as national and communal ones, as impediments or not to revolutionary practice. So the question of intellectuals and theory, the debate around organization and institutions like parties, and the anxiety created for political leaders, those who are interested in revolutionary practice, by attachments that don't seem to be the same as the ones they're promoting, ones that are national and communal. So there are many meditations on these questions all the way through the book, and the book does address them. But I'd like us to talk about whether you, Fadi, can actually offer us some conclusions about these three difficult questions. How would you formulate sort of terse answers to those three questions? And I just want to make one more point about the coda at the very end of the book. That coda, which I had not read until I read the book, because it wasn't there in the earlier versions, that seems to me to reveal the real stakes of the book. And that is, in it, Fadi strikes hard at Western Marxist critics, Western Marxists for the most part, critics of Arab intellectuals and their supposed fall from theoretical grace. There, Fadi defends what he calls the labors of the situated and accountable critic against those who insist on, quote, the most updated version of critical theory, but who ignore the circumstances on the ground in places whose history and politics they barely appreciate. So I'd like to sort of hear more about that too. And I'd like to know if you think I'm right, that the stakes of the book are there, are in that final paragraph. That is saying just a minute to the purest Western Marxist critics of Arab intellectuals, and pointing out that there were histories and context within which decisions were made that are never taken into account when those criticisms are made. So I'll stop there and thank you for a terrific book and for the excuse to talk about it tonight.
Thank you so much, Joan.
Thank you, Professor Scott. In fact, I'm glad that you also paid attention to coda, and where you can see the contemporary relevance of this work, even though it talks about the generation that has seen Palestinian Nakba and Egyptian-Syrian Union and its dissolution, or the 67 war or Iranian Revolution. The book is also shedding light on contemporary struggles for freedom and human rights and democracy in the Arab Middle East. And one of the goals of the book theoretically is actually to question this obsession with Islam and the West in both in theory and the studies of history. And Fadi tries to show why we need to go beyond that duality in our scholarship. So our next commentator, Professor Yasmeen Diafallah from University of California, Santa Cruz, Politics Department. She is writing a book on this topic too. It's called Thinking Past Islam and the West, Theories of Political Subjectivity in Contemporary Arab Thought. So we turn to her right now. Professor Diafallah studied in Cairo University, Egypt, and then MA and PhD in Political Science Department of University of California, Berkeley. Professor Diafallah, floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this generous introduction and for allowing me to be part of this roundtable about a book that I am really excited to talk about with everybody today. I am also very glad that Professor Scott ended with talking about the stakes of the book. And this is exactly what was haunting me as I was reading through the book, its stakes. And because I like to think with questions, I'm going to kind of launch what I want to say with some of the few questions that these kind of evocative questions that the book brought out to me. How do ideas translate into specific intellectual and political practices And how does political practice get wielded back into ideas during the high tides of revolutions and in their often anticlimactic aftermaths? How are emancipatory projects theorized and lived in the heat of political struggles? And how are they dwelled upon, grieved, and repurposed in the wake of their dead ends, as David Scott would put it? Revolution and Disenchantment is a book about intellectual revolutionary fervor and post-revolutionary disillusionment, but more importantly, it's about the critical yet untheorizable relationship between theory and practice in the heat of anti-colonial and more generally emancipatory political struggle. Its protagonist is the Lebanese New Left, a minority Marxist tradition that emerged in the late 60s and faltered in the wake of the Lebanese Civil War of 75 to 1990. Its thrust is much broader, however. It's the questioning of what Fadi calls the metropolitan unconscious of our critical traditions. That is, the tendency of critical theory to take the explicit or implicit opposition to the West as the chief credential that qualifies a theoretical tradition as truly critical. Instead, the book offers a sustained account of an instance of critique that does not feature the West at its center, neither as model nor as colonizer, even while thoroughly cognizant of its predominance as chief knowledge producer and imperial force. Though at first glance the book is about the trajectory of new left Lebanese intellectuals, it posits a significant theoretical intervention in post-colonial studies, studies of Arab political thought, and critical theory more generally. This intervention is the book's, to me, of course, from my end here, is the book's contestation of what it calls epistemological critique as the most adequate modality for understanding, interpreting, and critiquing intellectual productions in the colony and post-colony, in the Arab world and beyond. Epistemological critique, broadly understood, is the consideration of post-Enlightenment values such as reason, freedom, democracy, as specifically European ideals that were posited by an imperial Europe as universal goods and as the ultimate standards for achieving good life and the good polity. As such, epistemic critique deconstructed the view common among Orientalists, Euro-American social scientists, and anti-colonial nationalists that the closer individuals and societies approximated those values, the higher their position was on the ladder to progress and away from backwardness of traditional modes of being. Indeed, one could read the various parts of the book as an extended attempt to substantiate that claim about the inadequacy of epistemological critique through presenting a different mode, an alternate mode of engaging post-colonial thinkers and texts that is not based on epistemological critique. Instead of focusing on interrogating, validating, and or disqualifying the conceptual apparatus of anti-colonial, in this case Lebanese thinkers, in terms of their proximity or distance from Enlightenment European thought, be that liberal or Marxist, as is common in post-colonial theory and critical scholarship on contemporary Arab thought, Fadi uses a blend of ethnographic, intellectual, historical, and theoretical method to shift our attention to another set of questions related to those thinkers, what he calls those thinkers, critical ethos, intellectual sensibilities, sense of positionality, terrains of social accountability, and intellectual autonomy. As such, I read the book as a multi-layered argument about the insufficiency of epistemology critique to capturing the gist, thrust, workings, spirit, and intellectual prowess and complexity of leftist traditions in contemporary Arab thought. These traditions are often viewed as too close and therefore consciously or unconsciously complicit with European theory, and therefore easily dismissible and certainly not worthy of the examination reserved for truly indigenous modes of thinking. This argument is delivered, Fadi's argument is delivered through different modes and comes in two parts. Whereas I read part one of the book as delivering it through a blend of political and intellectual history, intellectual ethnography, and biography, I read part two as working through theoretical clarification and juxtaposition. I'll just say a few words about that. before posing a few questions. Part one of the book, as I see it, tries to show that the complexity of the Lebanese New Left lies not only or even mainly in its theoretical formulations and how close or far these were from the metropole. Rather, it lay in its tight attunement to the world of politics, comprising both Lebanese politics with its multiple colonial imbrications and sectarianism, as well as the regional politics of Arab nationalism. And because those thinkers are situated in the global 60s and are of their time with their decolonial struggles, political mobilizations the world over, the world of the Lebanese New Left also stretched far beyond Lebanon and revolutionary Arab countries to third worldist revolutions in China, Vietnam, Cuba, and to the world of theoretical production and its practice in France and the UK, as we see. The book shows us, therefore, that the reason that Marxist critique posed by these thinkers to Lebanese and Arab politics resonated was not because it was epistemological, but because it was tightly connected from very early on, from the high school years of a Trabolsi or a Sharara or a Baydun, some of the stars of the book, with the specifics of local politics, its critique always woven to the broader forces of imperialism, capitalist exploitation, worker struggles, third world revolutions operating in the world at large. Part one ends with the eruption of the Lebanese Civil War, Iranian Revolution of 1979, crushing of Palestinian resistance in 1982. The world is undone, in a sense, for this generation. Unsettling, here the book unsettles the typical periodization of Arab thought that thinks of it as either as pre and post 1967, 1967 being the defeat of Arab revolutionary regimes vis-a-vis Israel, the Six-Day War. Here, Bardawil gives us another significant juncture, that of 1961, the secession of Egypt from the United Arab Republics, and therefore the failure, the faltering of the first truly revolutionary experiment, and 1982, the point of the eclipse of the last revolutionary subject, the Palestinian freedom fighter, or the embodied in the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and the death of the dream of a united Arab progressive Lebanon, together with the birth of the Islamic Republic, featuring a starkly different modality for national liberation on the global scene. While certainly featured in the story, the Imperial West is not its main protagonist. Neither are adaptations of or opposition to Euro-American theories at its forefront, as its epistemological critique would have it. By returning the spotlight to where it truly belongs, the immediacy and the urgency of war-torn worlds and eclipsed revolutionary dreams, Revolution and Disenchantment dethrones the primacy of that mode of seeing and knowing Arab and post-colonial thought. Part two operates somewhat differently, but it still illustrates that inadequacy in two additional ways. The first works through zooming in on the intellectual and political trajectory of Waddah Sharara, the most theoretically sophisticated of Socialist Lebanon's members. By following Sharara's ventures into Maoism and then Ibn Khaldun, a 14th century Muslim jurist and historian, the book gives two specific examples of how theoretical concepts are mobilized to make sense of and take part in ongoing political crises while in their midst, not in a university office in the metropole. I am in one, so no offense there. Such is Sharara's drawing on Maoism to redeem mass political mobilizations, even along sectarian lines, vis-a-vis pervasive Leninist vanguardism of his day. The picture that these multiple theoretical adaptations, some would even say adventures, produces is a far stretch from theoretical neatness. In blending an Italian Marxist with a Muslim historian, Sharara is not concerned with epistemological consistency, but again, and always, with responding to the demands made by a crisis-ridden reality to be understood. The final, I would call it punch maybe, to epistemological critique is delivered, I would say, through juxtaposition between indigenous intellectuals or indigenous and global, I would say, intellectuals who deploy and repurpose theory as a guide to real life politics, pressing, immediate, urgent, and diasporic intellectuals invested in the politics of theory, or theoretical anti-imperialism, as Fadi calls it. That is, in deconstructing and undoing the categories that modern Europe had set up to know and to exert power over the world. Between, on the one hand, those committed to an immanent critique of post-colonial modes of subjugation, and those for whom emancipation could only operate on the level of liberation from the epistemological violence of imperial modes of knowing and producing knowledge, on the other hand. Fadi does not necessarily privilege one modality over the other, but through juxtaposing them, the book also levels the playing field between them. The politics of theory is not particularly equipped to take the podium and gaze upon situated theorizing from above. Neither does it have the embeddedness and attunement required to theorize about the intricate workings of the politics of oppression in the post-colony. If anything, it operates on a level then that, for most, seems aloof and whose urgency is not always apparent. To me, then, epistemological critique of Arab intellectual production and post-colonial thought more generally animate this book and haunt it. They loom largest in its beginning and its ends, but they can be seen throughout. And the question that I kept coming back to as I read through the various multifaceted critique that Fadi so compellingly delivers to this mode of analyzing Arab thought is what possibilities would open up if the book was not thoroughly haunted by the specter of epistemology critique. I ask this of Revolutionary and Disenchantment as I ask it of myself, as someone whose work is also invested in embedded and embodied practices of critique in the post-colony. What kinds of analyses are foreclosed, perhaps, by being haunted by critiques of Arab imbrication with European modes of knowing? And what imaginative horizons would open up if we cast that specter aside? I am sure that Fadi has some thoughts about this, because I could see in the book itself glimpses of what those possibilities might be. We see them, for example, when the book hints at how Arab Marxists like Fadi A and al-Azm have tried hard, Fadi tells us, in desperate political times via different theoretical strategies to defend Marxism's promise of universal emancipation. What, I ask, would a dwelling upon the analysis of those theoretical strategies have looked like? And I was wondering, Fadi, whether you thought that such a dwelling would be sufficient to serve the ultimate purpose of setting off the alarms of the epistemic critics, so to speak. We also see this when the book gestures at how the disenchanted Waddah Sharara uses Ibn Khaldun because Ibn Khaldun provides theoretically compelling insights, and not because he has the now appealing credentials of belonging to the Islamic tradition. And I wonder, what would a close and expanded examination of Sharara's Marxist, Maoist, Khaldunian theorizations have looked like? What would a full-fledged analysis of critique of power by Abaydun or Sharara that does not take imperialism as its target tell us? How would a delving deep into these synthetic formulations with multiple theoretical depths and avid political investments look like if we were not encumbered by the lurking eye of epistemological critique? I have to say, and I end by this, that I ask these questions from the position of someone who thinks of Revolution and Disenchantment with its elegant, vivid, compelling, and at times amusing and ironic formulations as exactly what scholarship in post-colonial and especially contemporary Arab political thought needs to stage its work. Would somebody like me, for example, need to stage my work, to examine contemporary Arab intellectuals as political theorists of their condition? In that respect, I read this book's intervention as not only one that teaches us about a previously unexplored genre of post-colonial Arab intellectual life and practice, Neither does it only dismantle the critique of European epistemologies as the only way to conduct critical scholarship in Arab thought. It conducts the necessary theoretical ground clearing that would enable scholars of Arab and post-colonial thought to stage the granular, sustained, generous yet critical, extended, expansive readings of those intellectuals as thinkers. That is, to unapologetically inhabit their political intellectual spaces, as we would, for example, do very easily with a Locke or a Habermas. So that's the spirit with which I asked those questions, and with which I also thank Fadi for writing it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yasmeen.
Thank you, Professor Diafallah. I think I'm muted. For this great clarification and commentary on the book. It is, in fact, one of the great achievements of this book is to rescue one or two generations of great Arab intellectuals from this epistemic duality of Eurocentric theory versus indigenous Islamic theory, right? That I think one of the big achievements of this book is to say that when we have this obsession, theoretical obsession that Eurocentric theory does not help to explain Asia, Africa, Middle East, and Muslims, we do a great injustice to a group of intellectuals who actually thought beyond these duality of Islamic indigenous thought versus Western thought, and there was something beyond that. In fact, our next speaker, Professor Gary Wilder, taught a lot about this topic in his book, Freedom Time, Negritude, Decolonization, and the Future of the World. Professor Gary Wilder is at a PhD program of anthropology with cross appointments in history and French at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, where he is also director of the Committee on Globalization and Social Change. His next book is called Untimely History, Unhomely Times on the Politics of Temporality and Solidarity, which will be published by Fordham University Press. Since Fadi's book also deals with the relationship of the past to the present and also the complex intellectual international politics of solidarity, we look forward to hearing from Professor Gary Wilder.
Thank you, Cemil, and thank you, Fadi. This book was a joy to read, as I'm sure my other panelists agree, and it is a joy to have Fadi as an interlocutor. I'm sure there are others who are better equipped or situated to comment on the book, but it's an honor and a pleasure to have the opportunity to do so. So much that's good about it and exciting about it. It was difficult to boil it down to a few points and a few questions, but like Joan, my first word is rigorous in my notes here. I start by saying this was a rigorous reconstruction of the emergence and demise of socialist Lebanon and the generation of polyglot Marxists who composed it. Fadi pays attention to the movement's emergence as these young militants, disillusioned with Arab nationalism, began to appropriate Marxism to understand their own historical situation. So through the book, one of the big things Fadi does is trace their intellectual formation, but also he elaborates their political habitus and pays close attention to the substance of their critical thinking. And central here, as Joan mentioned, was a transversal practice of translation and transfiguration through which they both adopted and reworked Marxian categories and frameworks, not only Western Marxian categories and frameworks, I might add, in order to analyze the forms of unfreedom they confronted and to envision the possibility of emancipation. Of course, at the same time, as reconstructing this movement's political way of being, let's say, it's also an insightful account of this generation's movement from being militant socialist revolutionaries committed to societal emancipation to disenchanted academics, not all of them, concerned with grasping the embedded and enduring power of various communal solidarities, whether familial, territorial, or religious. one of the things this book does is contribute to the discussion of post-revolutionary disenchantment and afterlives in a really useful and important way, rather than telling a now familiar story, although important, about failure, trauma, despair after the end of revolutionary hopes or projects or possibilities. He traces how concrete historical developments required a careful rethinking of earlier positions and a direct engagement with new sets of problems that require different approaches and analyses. In other words, he doesn't stop at the moment of disenchantment. That is a new beginning, a new opening for reading closely the amazing work that this group of thinkers did after disenchantment. And I think that seems to be unique in that conversation about disenchantment. Along the way, while he tells this story of, along the way, Bardawil traces this intimate and dynamic relationship, as Yasmeen and Joan mentioned, between their theoretical concerns and worldly events, whether the Nakba and the Palestinian liberation struggle and the Algerian War, or the collapse of the United Arab Republic and the failures of Nasserism, Pan-Arabism, and Baathism, the 1967 defeat, the Iranian Revolution and subsequent Islamic awakening, and that 1982 event we heard about. So we get an alternative political history of this whole period through these intellectuals, or his account of them. And I was also struck by his decentering 1967 as the key watershed event for thinking about Arab thought in this period. But at the same time, as we've heard, Bardawil tells a parallel story about the growing disjuncture between the analytic and political concerns of this generation of Middle East radicals, radical intellectuals, and their counterparts in metropolitan Western universities. He sometimes characterizes this as a political versus a theoretical critique of empire, as Yasmeen just said. But he also emphasizes that just as Arab leftists began to critique Arab nationalism, state authoritarianism, and social inequality within these societies, diaspora thinkers were positing new binaries between North and South, East and West, that did not easily allow for those kinds of political critiques and social self-reflection. And just as metropolitan theorists were rejecting universality as such, Lebanese intellectuals were struggling to envision a life in common in the context of sectarian civil war. And that these metropolitan Arab intellectuals effectively converged with and effectively, whether intentionally or not, supported the position of many reactionary Islamists after the Iranian Revolution, who were also attacking Marxism and left politics in the name of cultural authenticity and epistemological purity. So that is as important as the story of the rise and demise of socialist Lebanon. And I would also add another strand that running through this book is a second order set of epistemological reflections on political anthropology, intellectual history, critical theory, and post-colonial studies. So in the tradition of Talal Asad and David Scott within anthropology, Fadi insists that the phenomena of political thinking, intellectual traditions, and scholarly self-reflections are themselves objects of anthropological inquiry, or should be. He offers us this generative idea of fieldwork and history that maybe he can say more about. And like Edward Said, he insists on the worldly character of theory as mobile and transnational. And throughout, he asks and shows what forms theory may assume and what work it does do or can do in particular political situations. It's always situated thinkers using theory in situated way, or situated experiences produce certain kinds of theories. So he challenges the idea, the anthropological idea, that the field is a place, he says, of messy, concrete facts, and somehow metropolitan universities are the site of abstract theory production, which are somehow clearer. He insists on the messiness of theory. He thus broadens the often, as Cemil was saying, often provincial fields of intellectual history and critical theory, and what we might call a canonical Marxology, to include non-European thinkers who both drew upon non-Western theoretical traditions and made signal contributions to what is typically, but incorrectly understood to be Western theory, Marxism being crucial there. He thus contributes in very exciting ways to the whole conversation about theory from the South that has been working its way across different fields in recent years. And I think he also does so in a way that challenges post-colonial theories. And this is what Yasmeen was talking about with the critique of epistemological critique. He does so in a way that challenges post-colonial theories' typical preoccupation, not exclusive, but often the typical preoccupation with empire as its primary object of critique, and with Western versus non-Western epistemology as the central axis of difference that needs to be investigated, and the kind of corollary concern about cultural authenticity versus imperial complicity, as Cemil mentioned. Bardawil suggests that such analytic frameworks are not well equipped to understand the thinking and politics of this generation of militant Lebanese intellectuals, or the kind of political questions they were asking and situations they were confronting. So by reading closely these socialists on their own terms, rather than simply as Westernized intellectuals, Bardawil effectively deprovincializes their thought. Certainly their thinking was bound up with their political struggles and challenges. But Fadi also seems to suggest that they grappled with political and theoretical questions and developed insights and orientations whose significance exceeds the context in which they were developed. They can inform our thinking about all manner of questions today, I think. So these are some of the reasons I think that Bardawil calls this a work of post-colonial theory. And if I read him correctly, or I should say, I read the book also as a charter or a call for something like post-colonial studies or post-colonial theory. So the lingering questions I have are all about discussing that very exciting, powerful, and important prospect. And that will be one of the many reasons why this book is widely read and discussed in a number of fields. So I'm going to shift registers and talk to you, Fadi. I'm going to use the language of you rather than him because I'm asking questions. So at the center of your analysis is the concept of emancipation, which is also central to the work of your interlocutors. But you sometimes write as if this was and is a self-evident term. I kept wondering what specifically they meant by emancipation at that moment, what you mean by it when you talk about them, and how we might take their thinking about emancipation up for our challenges today. Indeed, throughout, I kind of wanted you, as forceful as it is, you have a very forceful and clear and hard voice, as hard in the best way, hard-hitting voice all throughout. And yet I still wanted you to weigh in more directly on your investment in these questions, on what you think is at stake analytically and politically for us now, because that's why a post-colonial studies is interesting, not because it's a new and better kind of critique. In other words, I wanted you to shift gears even more often than you did, and you do often, from the register of historical anthropology and intellectual history to that of self-reflexive critical theory. You begin the book by situating your work and questions in relation to the Arab revolutions of 2011, which you suggest explode or call into question the false opposition between anti-imperial nationalism and liberal anti-imperialism. But then you end with a more restrained set of epistemological reflections. Now, I also loved the conclusion to the last chapter and loved the coda. I think these are some of the best passages in the book about the way in which post-colonial binaries, colonizer, colonized, East-West, secular, Islamic, etc., continue uncritically often to inform scholarship today, and the way in which certain kinds of difference are underscored and certain kinds of difference are effaced by contemporary scholars, and what's at stake in that and the politics of that. And I love those passages and I love that discussion. But you also sideline emancipation and politics at the very end. And I wondered where, it seemed to me like, is this a strange echo of the disenchanted Marxists and the metropolitan post-colonials that you are talking about, especially since you remind us so forcefully somewhere in there that political questions cannot be settled by better theory. My point is not that you should give us the answer to all of our political questions today, but I guess, I'll just turn it into a question here, which is to ask you to possibly say more about the question and the status of emancipation or Marxism, or what you call thick ideologies today, for your comrades in Lebanon and the Middle East, for critical intellectuals generally, for post-colonial theory, or for a post-colonial studies. I would have also liked to hear a stronger case for why we should read this generation of thinkers today. I mean, I was persuaded, and part of the joy of this was getting a whole new bibliography of works to try to track down if there are translations of them. You rightly say that you are not suggesting that their analyses could answer our very different problems now, that you want neither to nostalgically invoke them in a spirit of left melancholy, nor smugly reject them, like for being modernizers or vanguardist Marxists or the wrong kind of Marxists or not good post-colonials. So that is terrific. I love the bit where you say, above all, you want to rescue their ethos, which you describe as a commitment to tracking the global present, a refusal of professionalism and expertise, and a political imaginary that, as you say, was not, quote, locked on the tired north-south, east-west path. So you do tell us why, and yet in such a work of kind of loving and careful, not only reconstruction, but engagement, I still wanted to hear a bit more and was hoping in this conversation that you could elaborate more on the potential significance of that ethos for us now, whether politically or theoretically, how their legacy might speak to us today. I have three more quick points, questions that are much less kind of central and important here, about some terms and some moves that I loved, but again, wanted more of. So generation is another important concept in the analysis, but I wasn't always sure what kind of work it was doing for you, and more importantly, maybe how you think other of us might take it up to do related work. So I would love to hear a little bit more about what for you was opened up or illuminated by using generation as a key concept in organizing your understanding of these intellectuals. Another point, you offer this wonderful reading of the gap between Edward Said's cultural and epistemological concerns with empire, and this cohort's social and political concerns at home, as you often said. And I loved the analysis of the reception, the careful analysis of the reception of Said in Lebanon. It was fascinating. But I also wondered why you place so much weight on Said's shoulders, when in fact, his legacy often points in a very different direction. And there are other thinkers then and since where you could have offered similar analyses of. Maybe more importantly, so I was wondering why the choice to kind of weight all that kind of culturalist and epistemological orientation on Said's shoulders. But I was also wondering whether today there is an analogous gap between, for example, a metropolitan theoretical concern with the Islamic tradition on the one hand, and on the other, the ways that the Arab revolutions may have exploded, as you said, any easy opposition between anti-imperialist nationalists and liberal anti-imperialists. Is metropolitan theory continuing to use binaries that, in a sense, are diverging, not just from the political realities of the contemporary Arab world, but through the kinds of debates and reflections and concepts that are being developed among critical militant political intellectuals there now? And finally, in a similar spirit, you offer this astute critique of Susan Buck-Morss for categorizing Middle East intellectuals as either failed imitators of the West or autochthonous critics, It was very persuasive and it fit beautifully. But many scholars, including enthusiastic and deeply sympathetic readers of Buck Moore's, and I would include myself in there, probably wouldn't turn to her for insight about these thinkers. So I'm just wondering if what you saw present in Buck Moore's characterization, that either or, is an ongoing tendency among scholars of contemporary Arab thought or Lebanese theory, etc. And if so, what we should make about that. And the final question just opens up the big question that they were asking and that you were tracing, which is part of what you're tracing is a kind of loss of a certain shared political language among the worldwide anti-imperialist left. And you also underscore the ways in which the members of Socialist Lebanon, through their practices of translation and transfiguration, through the ways in which they were not especially concerned with epistemological authenticity or origin, developed something like a transversal universalism. We might call it that. I was looking back in the book, I didn't see exactly the spot. So I guess on those two fronts, and I agree, without falling into anything like a left melancholy, I wonder what you think about the loss or the lack of something like a shared political language among the worldwide anti-imperialist left. Is that a problem? Is that a relief? Is it possible today? Is it desirable today? And I'll just stop by quoting one of many, many terrific sentences of yours in the book, which is that you suggest, you have the sentence, and I'll just say the whole book is about this. You talk about, quote, thinking in politically saturated and precarious conditions. And of course, you were talking about these specific intellectuals, and that was exactly the paragraph that Joan quoted, where you said, look, you can't smugly stand outside and attack them for not being so, sophisticated or the latest. But we, as we think in politically saturated and precarious conditions, I continue to wonder what this legacy might offer us now, not in the way of solutions, but as you say, in the spirit of an ethos. So I'll stop there and thank you for this book. I loved it.
Thank you so much, Gary.
Thank you, Gary. These are a great set of questions. In fact, at one point I was going to suggest Fadi to title the book Emancipation Time, following Gary's book Freedom Time, but now Gary asked the question of why freedom, emancipation. So I would like to hear Fadi's response on these issues. So before I give the floor to Fadi, I want to know to our audiences from all over the world, we have about 130 people, is that after Fadi's comments, I will read your questions to him. We may also have panelists still join the conversation. So please type your questions. Now I'm monitoring and moderating the questions. Because of large size, I won't be able to give everyone the chance to speak, but I hope to represent all the questions in terms of combining some of them, but summarizing and sometimes reading questions. Please, I will see your names, but you can also introduce yourself when you type your questions. So please type your questions in the chat section for everyone. Thank you. Fadi, the floor is yours in terms of your response to the panels.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I mean, I couldn't have asked for more. I'm really humbled. I mean, a lot of the ideas in the book were basically, generated by conversations with friends around and with Gary and Yasmeen, and without Jones's prodding, this book would not have been finished. So there is an immeasurable debt, and thank you so much for giving more today. And before I start trying to answer, I just want to thank Elle McLarney tremendously for making this happen. I mean, she's the one who pushed me to have the event, and Griffin for all the labor he put into it, and Cemil for graciously sort of accepting my invitation to moderate. I think I would need like 2-3 hours at least to respond to the questions. I will try, and I took as much notes as possible. I'll try to combine some of them and try and sort of address some of the themes. So that coda that came that came back in the three responses. In Jones and Yasmeen and Gary added something about it at the end. It is true that, I mean, there is a tension that in the book that it's a tension that I embody myself, which is an attraction to highly abstract critical theory as a source of lucidity and a critical kind of like sort of path into, you know, rising above the sort of, you know, the morass of everyday life and gaining clarity. But at the same time, I'm ambivalent about how that kind of theory could turn into some kind of contraption that erases basically political practice on the ground, or becomes an element in adjudicating who is basically a valid actor or thinker. I mean, one example would be the Arab revolutions and how a lot of people on the left thought that these were not proper revolutions, either because they were not anti-imperialist enough, or because some of them thought they were sectarian, particularly in the case of the Syrian revolution, or because they thought that these revolutions did not produce any theory, and there is no theory without a revolution. So here is a clear real world example of when I sort of, that tension that I have, which is basically the sort of like the necessity for critical theory, and at the same time how critical theory should not be equated and collapsed into critique. There's different modalities of critique which do not always have to take the form of basically abstract critical theory. And that goes back to Jones basically and Gary's and Yasmeen's coda, whereby John is absolutely right. This is part of the stakes of the stakes of the book. It's also part of the sort of personal drive of me writing that book, because I'm like that can't be, you know, that can't be so simple that, you know, that you basically toss these thinkers who are basically very much, you know, at the heart of their present. And this is another thing that I'm attracted to, that sort of Gary mentioned and Yasmeen mentioned. How do you sort of conceptualize the now that you are in order to intervene in it? Because part of my attraction to them is that they're not historicists. And the labor that the concept of emancipation does for me, that I agree with Gary, I do not dwell on it enough, because I sort of use it, so to speak, as a concept that they themselves work with. And for them, it's mostly an emancipation from capitalist exploitation and sectarian political structures, because they're from that generation. And the labor it does for me is that you see bodies and minds thinking about how to intervene in the now, and they're not thinking about modernization. They're not thinking in a teleological historicist way. They're trying to find an in to their present, which is something that Yasmeen sort of like emphasized. And that's where translation is key. Translation is key politically, but also historically, because it is part of, you know, part of what translation does, I think, is that it enables, you know, it enables, so to speak, the labor of mediation of a body of thought that basically sort of like, you know, transports it and transfigures it, as I said, so that it becomes basically adaptable to this work, while at the same time trying to, and this is something I don't elaborate on, but Gary touched a bit on, when he talked about a life in common, trying to think about a universal which is the result of articulation, and not a universal which is a result of subsumption. So the labor of translation is a labor of trying to think together, you know, and that's, you know, that's a conversation I've had with friends in the past, and they said, well, the condition of possibility of enabling this is having a history with a big H, which basically unifies all these people on one discursive ground, whereby they can translate, but at the same time, there is still a promise in a history that is going to redeem these struggles at the end of the day, even if they were not historicists. And so what do you do now when that sort of like ground has splintered? But my attraction to translation is precisely related to these two things. It's one way in which you can articulate some kind of a weak universal, which is, unlike notions like rights or reason that do not need translation, with the Marxist, the sort of like Marxist tradition always was premised on the necessity of translation, because precisely the validity of a particular thought is related to its own context. So that work needed to be done. You just cannot transpose the binaries of, reason, superstition, or freedom on freedom, etc. You need to work. I mean, that's a basic Marxist insight. You need to work with, what's at hand. So translation is at the heart of the book. And I would say, one last thing which is related to this universal as a result of articulation, which is translation is one condition of possibility of political solidarity. Maybe we can have more of a conversation about that, and Gary's been working on this for a long time. And when you don't translate certain struggles, for example, or you use theory to foreclose them from the domain of what is thought to be emancipatory politics, you're already denying solidarity with them. Think the Arab revolutions. So it's not only a theoretical point. It's a point of, there is a necessity to re-articulate certain concepts so that basically, there's this quote I've always used from César's letter of resignation from the Communist Party, where basically it is, it's about the people, not the concepts. So it's the concepts that have to sort of fit, the people, not the people that have to fit the concepts. Joan's 3 questions about intellectuals, the organization, and the question of community are tremendous questions. And some people would claim that, the question of the organization is one of the sort of urgent questions of our time, of how to rethink the mediation of theory and practice in the wake of, failure of leftist traditions and their forms of organization. The question of community, I think, is for me very crucial, and my attraction to thinking with Sharara is related to how it's hard to theorize the question of community. And Partha Chatterjee said something along these lines a while ago, and he tries to work through conceptualizing it through the distinction between political society and civil society. It's very hard, and that's why Sharara's attraction to Ibn Khaldun is that because it gives him sort of formal concepts that are whose content can be filled in different ways. It's basically about subjugation. It's about a particular ways in which power works when Gramscian hegemony is not around. So I will move. We can talk more about these questions, but I think there are we cannot turn our backs to them. Part of the difficulty, I think, today is that the concept of the political has been widened and stretched, and that's basically a comment that Wendy Brown did a long time ago. And when the concept of basically the political has been stretched and widened so hard, then the question of thinking about what is the appropriate form, organizational form, to think about the many meanings and valences of what we think of as political today, as opposed to like in the old Marxist sense of there is a main contradiction, and then the kind of mediation between theory and practice is centered around this main contradiction. So how do we think today about these things? How does that thinking about the sort of widening of the concept of the political translate itself into an appropriate organizational form is, I think, a very difficult question, but an urgent one. Yasmeen, thank you so much about your reading of Epistemological Critique. It is at the heart of the book, and it is, and I tried to do, I tried to do many things in this book, and it's for readers to judge if I succeeded or not. One of them is that I wanted a book that could be read in Beirut and in the US academia. So the stakes are, so even though I am writing a story, and this is what I tried to call in the introduction, a tension between history and theory. And I'm writing for something, but I'm also writing against something. And that against is epistemological critique. And this is part of me trying to really sort of like sublimate a very, very, very personal project into a project which in a way manages to be, to sort of be in resonance with the multiple sites I inhabit myself. I'm not sure really how, I mean, an Arabic translation is nearly done. I'm reviewing the proofs now. So I'm not sure how the book will be read in Arabic, but part of the stakes of doing that work to answer Gary's question, when it comes to thinking about it as a book that should be, that would be read in Beirut, is what I call an intergenerational conversation, and one that goes against amnesia, and one that is trying to use interviews and archives, to go back to Joan's great question about interviews, as a way to sustain a tradition of basically intellectual inquiry alive. So Joan, you're absolutely right. This is not oral history. These interviews do much more for me. They're a way of basically reanimating a particular space of argument and trying to think through it in the present and think through its stakes. I learned a lot about doing that by reading the long interviews of David Scott that he's done with Caribbean thinkers in small acts. I think it's basically a technique of ethnography where so for example, someone like Waddah Shalala, I have around 60 to 70 hours of tape with him. So when you're thinking about like that archive of audio, so it is not about sort of asking someone to tell you about their lives and it's over. Like each conversation is an opening to another conversation that basically opens up different facets, and then the kind of horizons of the past, present, and future sort of are embodied in that moment. And I tried to do that with Talal. So I'm very happy that you sort of like, when you said that I managed to extract things from him, and this is precisely what I was trying to do, is to sort of, sit with him. And that took, that interview took around 3 hours, the one I did with Talal, which was basically just me and him, on a table for 3 hours recording, and, pushing, thinking, sticking to some of the questions we had in advance, but then branching off the questions as well. So that basically it's a thought that's co-produced in the moment. It is not an oral history. And that's what basically enables me to bring these traditions to become alive again. And, and I hope I would love to do more. I would love to do more of these interviews. They require a lot of time though. And then there are straightforward ethnographic techniques that one can lean on, and psychoanalytic ones, like listening for the silences, listening for stumbling, and then finding a way to sort of go back to that silence and trying to turn that silence into something that could be talked about. So these interviews are at the heart of the intergenerational conversation that go against the politics of amnesia, and that tries to recapture in a way not only the stakes, the desires, the sort of futures they've inhabit. Gary's absolutely right also that the concept of generation is under theorized in the book. I use it because they use it. They refer to themselves as a 60s generation. So I did not do much in trying to think about it, because when you're working on intellectuals, as you know from this book, it's basically you are reflecting on people who constantly reflect on themselves and constantly, as Joan said, shift their own political, theoretical, and cultural sort of like identifications. So in a way, there's this, you have to think about You have to think about them and think about them rethinking about themselves in the same time, and trying to sort of like capture that without refining it. And the concept of generation, I've left it as is because they would refer to it. And you know, I would say one sort of something that I didn't write about in the book, but was quite interesting to me, is that when does it emerge? Like, when does the consciousness and the articulation of a we in terms of a generation, not in terms of a, you know, militants, takes place? And it's usually takes place after people move out of political practice, when they start reflecting back. And there's this line I love from Russell Jacoby's Dialectic of Defeat, where he talks about sort of Lukács moving away from political practice and distilling a life of practice into a text. So it's that moment of distillation where the question of generation sort of emerges as a nodal point of thinking of a we, which is no longer a we that was sort of, you know, making history, but one that is reflecting on its past history. So one moment where it emerges is after the 1982 invasion, which is the moment of big defeat, and the moment when the Palestinian Liberation Organization moves from Beirut to Tunis after the Israeli army invades Beirut. So in the wake of the defeat, there are some articles sometimes that are written where you see people sort of talking about us, the 60s generation, precisely because the 60s generation's coordinates map onto the coordinates of Palestinian struggle. So that moment is there. To go back to Yasmeen's question about what would be opened, it's a great question. I mean, I tried to do some of it, as you said. So this is not only a writing against, because precisely writing, if I'm only writing against epistemological critique, I'm kind of performing a sort of like a performative contradiction in itself. I'm trying to excavate an archive and give it its due while sort of putting it into a conversation. How would that sort of, what shape would that, you know, sort of dwelling on that archive without that labor of conceptual ground clearing? Because I had to do a lot of conceptual ground clearing, as you mentioned, Yasmeen. And you know, I don't know, one thing I would like to think about more that I mentioned, I didn't also develop, which is, you know, someone like Sharara, who was the theory head of the party, he comes to the conclusion that hegemony is very difficult in these societies in the middle of the civil war, because these are torn societies where basically communal allegiances are there. Then what do you do? And then he realizes that if these are in a very reflexive mode, he says, if these are torn societies, then I cannot subsume them with one or two concepts. So he moves from critical and revolutionary theory to ethnography and a history. And in that move, in a way, he turns his back to theory. And that's something that I didn't interrogate much, but I would love to sort of like dwell on more, which is, what does it mean to sort of, you know, turn your back to theory as a privileged mode of critique and a privileged mode of, you know, gaining lucidity and moving towards and a very, very sort of, he says himself, Jabarti influenced kind of history, whereby he has narratives over narratives over narratives. And so the reflexivity of the theorist pushes the theorists out of theory, which in a very ironic way renders him invisible to then basically people who work, you know, people who work on sort of critical theory, or basically thinking of him that he's not a theorist enough. So this idea of critical theory, critique, and how it's related to, you know, how one thinks of basically a reflexive position to one's society. Joan, do you have a question?
I just want you to sort of talk to the question of whether that Yasmeen raised, which was what possibilities would open if the book was not haunted by the epistemological critique. But I can't see that how it would be possible, because both your people, Tarara maybe above all, and you are haunted by the epistemological critique. There's no getting away from it.
He's not haunted. I was haunted because this was the way for me to, this was the way in which I realized that a lot of, a great intellectual work is being erased or not being its due by basically being accused of reproducing Orientalist taxonomies or being enmeshed in colonialist epistemology, or just these are liberal Muslims, therefore we shouldn't give them, the light of day. So these, for them, it is not a question, because we are not their audience. They are producing their work in Arabic and they are doing it. But for me, I had to address this in order to, I had to make to write against in order to be able to write for.
No, I understand that, but aren't your people at the same time, and that's where your issue of translation comes in.
Right.
Aren't your people at the same time always involved in some gestures to or thinking about, let's not call it epistemological critique, call it Western theory, whatever you want to call it. I mean, they're not free of the possibility of themselves reacting against a certain kind of Western Marxism, or, it seems to me translation, if you're going to talk about translation, then they are in some ways or another engaging with, if not haunted by, something that is part of this epistemological critique. But I didn't mean to interrupt. No. The history that you're giving us is one of entanglement. Right. So that being able to sort of separate entirely either you or your subjects is not possible.
I'm not separated. Yeah, I can't be separated. They are more easily separated, but they are entangled in one way. They are entangled in one way or another. And the way in which I tried to show this entanglement is in Ahmad Baidoun's review of Edward Said's Culture and Imperialism, where he says that's a great book, but after all, it doesn't say anything about what we're dealing with here, and we're dealing with people like Saddam, and that book calls Saddam an ugly face. He says something like that in that line, and there's much more here to talk about. And I use that to actually say about how is it that basically these forms of power and these forms of violence are condemned morally and ideologically, but are never in a way basically conceptualized. And it's mostly, the conceptual work is always a work of speaking back to the West, speaking back to empire. And the labor that the part of the thinkers I was working with were trying to do was a labor of trying to conceptualize this form of power, and not only to stop at the Eurocentric critique, so to speak. And that's again where this question of binaries and speaking back is crucial. So you're right in that, but I wouldn't call them haunted themselves in the way, but they sometimes have to speak back to it. Sometimes they can ignore it depending on the situation. I mean, that brings me back to the question of Gary about why Edward Said. Why Edward Said for multiple reasons. Partly because in books that have to do with the historiography of contemporary Arab thought, he's used as a theorist, he's not used as a thinker. So in a way, you reproduce the colonial divide between the local autochthonous intellectual and the theorist. So instead of thinking of Edward Said as an Arab intellectual alongside these Arab intellectuals, he's basically used as a frame. And it has nothing to do, it says not only about his metropolitan or location, or the fact that he wrote in not in Arabic. I mean, one of the most towering sort of like mid-20th century intellectuals that Yasmeen works on, Abdullah al-Arwi, wrote a lot in French. So it's not the question of language only. So part of the reason is to actually transform the theorist who wrote about traveling theory into a traveling theory himself. And in that way undo that colonial divide, not because I want to undo it, because actually he was friends with these people and they were in the same pro-Palestinian circuit. So actually the lives intersected. So it's not that it's basically academic disciplines that create that sort of distinction, as opposed to the sort of real interaction of these lives. That's one reason. The other reason is precisely because of the way in which the reception of Orientalism was overdetermined in the Arab world, was overdetermined by the Iranian Revolution, which basically led all of these Marxist thinkers like Mehdi Amil and Salih Jalal al-Azam to write very polemical books against Said. I mean, by an accident of history, that book and the Iranian Revolution happened at the same time, so to speak. And that moment is the moment of the turn from the left to, more and more politics of authenticity and modernity. I mean, it predated that. But if you look at, I've done some archival works in journals that, like Dirasat Arabiya, and you see the stuff in the 70s, it's all about Guevara, El Foco theories, guerrilla warfare, and starting from the 80s, you get all these notions about turath and modernity, tradition and modernity, authenticity, asala. So there's this wide discursive shift that happens in that moment. I'll say something about, and then I think I've talked a lot. I'll say something about the work that.
Fadi, if I were just, I don't want to cut you off, but I wanted to come in on precisely this point before it kind of slides, and to maybe also to go to Joan's point about the history of entanglement. This is, just to clarify, this is precisely what I was thinking about dwelling upon. Of course, these histories cannot be distinct. That is to say, Sharara and Baydun and so on are thinking with those categories, and the most interesting thing about them is that they are reflexively thinking about them, but their emphasis is not so much on, as it is with us, for example, or with metropolitan post-colonials, if this even is a phrase, is not with, emancipating ourselves from these concepts or just living with the fact that we are thoroughly pervaded by them. But their emphasis is on something else, on embedding these concepts in thinking about the ongoings and not being wedded to them dogmatically, rather shifting as reality demands. And this is maybe the labor of dwelling, or that I was more, or that I was asking, about, not so much to think of those as divorced worlds, because the complexity of those thinkers is all about thinking of them as really a one world. And you talked about universally much more eloquently as I could, more than I could ever do. But it's really about where the emphasis lies, where the gaze, or where the concern really is directed, and we know that our concern is not theirs, and that distance between us and them, or between what we're writing about them and between their own set of concerns, is of course part of the story of the book, maybe the most compelling, I would say, part of the story of the book, and it's the reason why it opens up so many possibilities.
Right. Yeah.
Fadi, we are receiving very good questions from the audience. Do you want to wrap up and I read some of them to you, or summarize?
Yes, I'll wrap up. I'll just say a few words about Gary's question about why go to Susan's work. And I think Susan, what I was interested in going to Susan's work is many things. One is she's interested in similar questions to mine, which is basically what she calls the pragmatic effects of theory and the performative effects of theory. That's one way, that's one reason why I read her and I was thinking with her, because she's not only thinking about translating people like Ali Shariati or Sayyid Qutb into English. She's thinking about what would that translation do in terms of pragmatic effect. Not many people join these two things together. So that's one way. The other reason I was, sort of Susan's work was interesting for me is because it's also very generous. And it's coming in the wake of 9/11. So it's basically opens up a new conjuncture in which basically this demand for translation of this sort of, theorists who work in the Islamic tradition is opened up. And third is precisely because she's doing that work as a political theorist. So engaging Susan had to do with basically the conjuncture, the generosity, the similar interest in the pragmatic effect of theory and its relationship to translation. Not many people have these things together. because some people would sort of like, either have, dismiss, for example, liberal Muslims or do something like that. But she's thinking about these two things together. And my concern, my worry about, her project was how she, then she ended up reinscribing that kind of binary by saying, these Islamists are great now, as opposed to the old Marxists. And I'm like, she couldn't, she didn't need to over-determine that reading, I think. And that was my first, sort of like worry. And my second one was about her reading of the pragmatic effects of theory. When she says, when we translate Shariati into Verso's critical, thinkers series or something like that, then it's one way of sort of, neutralizing the way in which he's read by Iranian reactionaries or something like that. And my reaction is that, he's been read, there is, generations of commentators on it. It is not one translation that's gonna do that labor. So going to Susan's work does multiple analytical work for me. And basically, yeah, I will stop here. It does a lot. It does a lot on all of these fronts. So as opposed to just going to someone who says, oh, these are, self-orientalists or westernized natives or so, or what have you. Yeah, Jamila, I'm done.
Well, I mean, as you can see, this book opens up a lot of important questions, conceptual issues that is also of contemporary relevance. And Fadi was very much engaged with and concerned with democratic revolutions or movements and revolutions in the Arab world and the broader region in the last 10 years. And so I'm very pleased, feel vindicated to see the first 4 questions from the audience. That also shows the relevance of your work for the broader scholarship. And I'm gonna do some sort of a summary of all 4, and then we start with the 4. Please write your questions. I will try to do that. So the 4 questions deal with this issue. The first 4 questions deal with the issue of not only the temporality of the generation with reference to David Scott, but also geographical entanglements, but also difference, right? So as Gary said, with the negritude movement, there is some sort of a difference of geographical emphasis on emancipation and freedom in different regions. So the questions that we first received is about Iran and India. And they're asking questions about the entanglements of different ways of thinking. I think you referred to how in the Iranian context was important for Lebanon. India was also important. So I think I'm gonna try to combine it. They all refer to, 2 of them refer to Ali Shariati and then 2 from India. And you can read the questions, but I will start reading with Arash Tabari's book, who recently wrote a great article on Ali Shariati and Frantz Fanon. He says, is proximity tantamount to truth? Are you advancing an epistemology and politics that privileges authenticity? Do you think something gets lost when you do so? The argument could be that people close to a revolutionary event, which often becomes a traumatic event, are not able to see what's happening accurately, especially when they are in it. How would you respond to the idea that distance and defamiliarization can generate insight? That's Arash's kind of more theoretical question, but I'm gonna do others as well. And I think one question from Salem, who works on Ali Shariati and Muslim socialism, and Mustafa Sibai, and asking about the relevance of your work to understand that transition to kind of Islamic socialism. And 2 questions on Indian left and Indian nationalism, one from Animesh Gupta, who is in Maulana Abul Kalam Azad Institute in Asian Studies, asking about the relevance of your work for the meaning of liberation and emancipation in the post-colonial South Asia. And Radhika Saraf is asking also about the relevance of your work on translations of Marxist-Leninist corpus in non-Arab areas. So you can also read these questions. I don't know how we should proceed. Fadi, you're reading the questions. Do you want to comment on some of these issues? And audience, please type your questions. Maybe I'm not good at, but Fadi is also reading.
I'm trying to read right now, yeah.
panelists, you can also intervene in some of the issues and questions that comes up while Fadi's reading.
Right. Let me just ask. Let me just answer Arash's question simply as and then Jamil, you can sort of like aggregate some of these questions, or if there's new ones while I'm answering. I'm definitely not advancing an epistemology and politics that privileges authenticity. In fact, I show in the book how the turn to Ibn Khaldun at that moment in time was done from different corners. One of it was from people who were concerned in authenticity and they wanted to shed precisely Western Marxist theory towards native theorists. And then there was Sharara's turn that was not at all a turn that was a sort of motivated by a politics of authenticity, but rather by, so to speak, a validity of the conceptual, universe that Ibn Khaldun produced in the absence of Gramscian hegemony. So proximity is not tantamount to truth, and my epistemology is not authentic at all. What I'm trying to think through is questions rather of accountability and positionality, and how that relates in a way to thinking about theory as an intervention that makes pragmatic effects in the world. You see, because part of the story that I'm telling that we didn't get to discuss today is basically how that generation had a very, I mean, I don't want to say fetishized theory, but basically they thought that they were very attached to Lenin's maxim, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. And that led them to sort of basically, because they're partly intellectuals, put all their weight on producing a theory that would be essential for a revolution. And then in the wake of emancipation, they realized in a way that so to speak, the correctness of theory is no guarantee of political practice. So to go back to your question, what I think I was, trying to think through is precisely how is it that in these, situations where you are accountable to, the community of people you are writing to and writing for and engaging, you produce a particular theory, and then the kind of social lives that basically this theory has outside of your purview. So no to sort of proximity and truth, but to go to distance and defamiliarization can generate insight, yes, but the thing is, how do you think about distance and defamiliarization? I mean, does distance mean physical distance, or does distance basically mean, in the case of the people I was working with, distance and defamiliarization were precisely moving out of the universe of political practice and the universe of Marxist conceptual theory, which sort of created a particular distance in which they recast their experiences. But thank you. That's a great question. Jamil, do you have any other questions for me? I'm finding it hard to sort of read everything simultaneously.
I guess one question that comes out of Salim's and others' intervention is that before your book, I could say before Fadi's book, the scholarship on Muslim, Arab, or the Middle Eastern intellectual history kind of assumed that there were secular leftist intellectuals versus the nativist intellectuals who were into authenticity, right? The culture, Ibn Khaldunians or Islamic intellectuals. And in the Iranian case, this has been studied very much, saying kind of through the impact of Heidegger and the new left, is that the turn from left to Islamism is mediated by Heideggerian notions of cultural authenticity. In your case, of course, you also show that the people who read Ibn Khaldun or theorized of sort of an authentic Arab thought were actually not the alternative ones, they are the same leftists. And I think that transition is you seem to have a new theory about that transition from the generation of 60s to 1980s.
Right.
There's a lot of left in the Islamism in the 80s, that is in terms of slogans and the inheritance and the connections.
Right. To go back to one of the questions that one of the respondents asked about disenchantment and thinking about disenchantment, I think it was Gary, I can't remember. Part of what I was interested in doing in this book is to actually track the kind of implosion of a unified political movements and the different directions people go in. And so one of the directions people went in is, after the Khomeini's revolution, was into a form of Khomeini's basically politics, which is Islamist and drew on a politics of authenticity. And what people sometimes are not aware of is that the mediating link that enabled them to go there is basically something like Maoism. Because it's Maoism that says that you have to be as close to the masses as possible. And if the masses are precisely, following an Islamic sort of like politics, then you drop Marxism and you become a Khomeinist, because you have to follow the masses. So the turn, so to speak, to an Islamist politics could be in a way mediated by Maoism itself. And that's, there's a quote. There's a quote I used by Roger Assaf, who was a very famous Lebanese, playwright and director, tremendously influential from the 60s generation, who says that I went into Islam like other people go into the factory, but we didn't have any factories in Lebanon. And which is basically, he's talking about the French Maoist établissement. He was very much in touch with the French Maoist établissement, which is the movement of French Maoists who mostly were intellectuals around the gauche prolétarienne, that basically would leave their schools and go and work in Renault factories or Peugeot or Citroën factories to be as close as possible to the workers. So for him, going into Islam after the Khomeini's revolution was like the others going to the factory, which is, if you think about it, a very puzzling idea. But the telos is, the guiding light of your life is the masses. So if the masses are in the factory, you go to the factory. If the masses, he says, in an ironic gesture, he said, we didn't have any factories in Lebanon, so I ended up basically going into Islam. That's one way to go into it. The other, other people turn back into the folds of their communal sectarian societies. And I try to do my best to sort of, to disengage communal sectarian politics from Islamist politics by saying that, one is secular and the other is not. So, and that's something that sometimes gets lost when people lump religious politics and sectarian politics into each other. So to go back to that question about comparison with Iran, there are many resonances. There are many resonances, especially in terms of like militant circuits in the 70s that move between southern Lebanon, that are in touch with the PLO, and Iran before the revolution. And there's also the resonance of thinking about, moving into the universe of Ibn Khaldun as you move into a sort of a politics of authenticity, for example. But there's also, there's also other things. And, there are people who never, and these are people that would be great to sort of have interviews with, to go back to Joan's questions. There are the people who never talk again. Like that break, to go back to Arash's question, that break creates a trauma, but that trauma basically, in a way, ends their political practice and ends their, discourse on their experience of the distilling of a life. Some lives are not distilled into texts and they're lost. And that project, in a way, privileged those who kept on thinking and rethinking and reproducing discourse about their lives because they were the major intellectuals. So that's why I carefully say that this is not the whole story. This is a story that's trying to answer the question of theory and practice. So some people go the Islamist way, some people go the sectarian way, some people become isolated critics, and some people fall silent. And these people who fall silent are, tremendously kind of interesting in their own right.
Fadi, I'm going to read Mesna Kato's question, and then I will go back to two questions on Indian Marxism. Mesna is asking, I wonder if you have any thoughts on the uptake of Black and Indigenous radical thought, themselves also declaring epistemological breaks, and the travels of that scholarship, particularly among more contemporary and younger Palestinian intellectual theorists and thinkers.
Yeah, that's a great question, Mesna. I mean, I haven't worked on that. Something that's always intrigued me, and you may know more about that, and I didn't work on it, is how the figure of the Native American appears in Palestinian thought and Palestinian poetry in different generations. So, I mean, there's the Darwish, of course, but there's I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Lies Sambar, the historian who early on sort of worked with that figure. But that's different from the question that you're asking, which is basically on the thought uh, of basically Black and indigenous radical thought. I think there is a beginning of a resonance of this kind of thought, but I cannot talk authoritatively on it. I'm more interested, honestly, personally, in how the earlier generation tried to compare the Palestinian experience to the experience of Native Americans. I mean, there's some of that in the interview that Gilles Deleuze conducts with Lies Sambar, that was published in the Journal for Palestine Studies, great French, sort of journal that died a few years ago. Because originally there was one in Arabic, one in French, and one in English, and now there's one in English and one in Arabic. But yeah, I mean, if you have any thoughts on the contemporary scene that I cannot talk authoritatively on, I would be happy to hear that.
Fadi, I'm going to combine two questions that are related to left in India. Maybe I re-articulate them. So Animesh Gupta and Radhika Saraf. So Animesh's question is they're both about the application of your theories of moving from nation, class to community in the Arab Lebanon, Middle East to the Indian case. So the first one is asking how you use the categories like emancipation and generation, and in this regard, about the possibility of categories like liberation in a more broader sense, that emancipation, in order to understand the contours of Arab Marxism. She's working on revolution and multiple meanings of nationalism in 20th century India. And Radhika's question is about, she works on Marxism in colonial Bombay, curious about the idea of universal as an aggregate of particular articulations. Do we not then retain the idea of an original? In an opposite sort of way, how would you formulate a criterion of critique of these translations themselves without privileging of an original Marxist-Leninist corpus? And now we have 4 questions coming while I'm thinking about this.
Okay, let me, the notion of liberation was quite used. I move a bit from it in the book because I position these thinkers and the way they position themselves as critics of national liberation regimes. And I don't, basically, I didn't want to sort of to have the category of liberation was a category that I used mostly when, thinking about the national liberation regimes that they were influenced by, when, influenced by their thinkers and the movements that ended up, forming them and then moved away from. But definitely the kind of work that liberation does work, but does some kind of work, but emancipation, I think, is wider, and that's why I privileged it in the book over liberation in that. Radhika's question, Jamil, about the universal, right, and the articulation, do we not retain an idea of an original? I'm not sure I understand how would that retain an idea of an original, and if by original you mean an authentic. The second part of the question I think is fascinating. How would you formulate a criterion of critique for these translations themselves without privileging an original Marxist-Leninist corpus? You're absolutely right. This is why I mentioned in a way that what they took for granted basically was the universal grammar of class contradictions. But taking the universal grammar of class contradictions for granted did not in itself come without the need for translation. So yes, in a way, that was basically the criterion for critique was class, and it was universal grammar, but it wasn't one that did not necessitate the labor of militancy and translation. And in answering the situation today, when I was trying to answer Joan's question, I said, this is part of the problem in a way today, that we do not have basically a universal grammar. And then Gary's question was like, you know, what is opened up and what is of course what is lost. I mean, what is lost is a ground that basically, on which, as Susan Buck-Morss says, you know, one can argue a ground on which one can agree to disagree. This is what is lost. And what is gained is basically what this ground itself sometimes complicitly erased, such as questions of gender, questions of environment, questions of race. But then the question of articulation still remains, remains present. You're absolutely right. We are working today, you know, and trying to think about, translations to foster an international solidarity without having a universal grammar. Thank you. Yeah, that's part of what I'm thinking about, and that's what Gary's been pushing me to do more of in a critical theoretical register, as opposed to in a sort of historical, ethnographic, and critical theoretical register. Jamil?
I don't see more questions, but we have only 10 minutes. So I want to maybe also ask you about the contemporary relevance of your book. How well it's being translated into Arabic, and panelists can join in too. So I assume there will be some debate in Arabic. You intervene not only in our academic scholarship on the Middle East in reference to Susan Buck-Morss, but you also think deeply about what's happening in the region. And we have talked about this in, we are teaching class together, and you know, for example, in Adonis's case, why he supported the Iranian, well, in the first Iranian revolution, but then in the Syrian revolution, it was not showing the same support. So what do you expect in terms of your readers in Arabic and the interpretation of this book or this intervention in the Arab public spheres?
Yeah, I cannot, of course, think in advance, but I'll tell you what happened when I presented parts of this work in the past, which is a very different kind of intervention, a very different set of conversation. Partly a conversation set by, when you work on intellectuals which are very distinguished and they are still alive, they speak back. So there is a resistance to. There is a resistance, of course, to someone else writing your own history. And that's something I've always encountered. It's a resistance that takes basically the form that it usually takes in interviews, to go back to Joan, but now, because it's presented and it's a polished work, it's basically, it takes the form of, well, you shouldn't have talked about that as opposed to that. I mean, you privileged this instead of that. And then basically my answer is always, I'm writing from my own present ground. So I'm not writing, an encyclopedic history. I'm interested in particular sets of questions which I filter this history from. So in a way, but that's a good thing for me, because it in a way opens up again a conversation around these spaces of arguments and these intellectual traditions and these concepts. So that's one way in which in the past these sort of conversations, sort of were structured along, particularly with the people who were concerned in basically, whose lives were written about, or whose political parties were written about. Well, the question of displacing the historiography of 67 is something which I think, I'm personally interested in, again, bringing back these sort of like erased historiographical markers that were not determined by the question of empire, such as 1961, the rupture of the union between Syria and Egypt, which was a tremendous blow. And that, I think, is something that is, after the Arab revolutions, people, historians have been thinking about that. They're reworking that history. And I think it's interesting now from the perspective of our present to sort of not to sort of take for granted the categories of practice of the 60s generation as the main categories of analysis. I.e., if some of them experienced 67 as the kind of like caesura, others precisely did not experience that. And it's that kind of, it's that, how is it that our present demands a rereading of that past? So that's, I think, a lot of the conversations are going to be about what is the demand in the present for rethinking about that past, and how am I doing that, and whether there would be alternative ways of doing that. That's particularly one way of thinking, I think, about the book.
Fadi, since we have 6 minutes, I want to, before I give the panelists one last chance to do closing remarks, I want to announce on behalf of the center that I think this will be recorded and posted. So can Ellen or Griffin tell more about this, and then when this will be posted? And then we can probably use the last 5 minutes for closing remarks among the panelists and organizers.
Tonight's lecture is recorded for internal purposes. If you'd like to learn more about it, you could reach out to griffin.orlando@duke.edu.
Will you post this conversation on your webpage in the future?
Yeah,
After it's edited down, we'll get confirmations by everybody.
Well, in our last 5 minutes, I want to maybe go back to the panel and to celebrate the launching of this book. What would you like to, how would you like to conclude in terms of your observations of the book? And then Fadi will close the panel.
I just want to thank you again, Fadi. An occasion like this pre-COVID would have been an occasion for you to sell books and autograph them. And even if they can't have autographed copies, I would urge people to read the book. I think we've pointed out all of the reasons that it makes a huge contribution, both as a kind of as a set of arguments and as a methodological approach to these kinds of subjects. So I just want to again congratulate you, and I'm saving my book for you to autograph the next time I see you.
Thank you. I hope I see you soon. Thank you so much, Joan. I mean, I have a great debt towards you. And thank you for the 1848 quote. That's a wonderful quote. I had never seen it before. I just read it.
That's fabulous.
Yes, I am their leader and I must follow them. That's exactly it.
I know, but this was 1848. It was Maoism before Mao.
Right.
Thank you so much. I just really heartily wanted to thank Fadi for inviting me to be part of this, and to thank all the panelists and the audience for this really wonderful, intellectually stimulating conversation that is sometimes difficult to come by when we've not been seeing each other for a long time. For all the reasons that we've talked about, but also for more. Again, I also direct my speech to all of you out there, and I know you're there because I looked at the list of attendance and I see a lot of familiar names who are interested in studying intellectual production in anti-colonial, post-colonial settings. This is really an indispensable reading. It does exactly the kind of work that we all need to do, it kind of spares us the kind of work that we need to do to bring to light a lot of those incredibly rich intellectual traditions. And thanks to Fadi, we can keep on citing him, and citing the many parts of his eloquently, engagingly, and really very well written theoretically, but also in terms of its prose, piece of work. Thanks to him for doing this, that we can then start doing the kind of work that we all need to do.
So much. Thank you.
Gary?
Sure.
Gary, where are you? I can't see you.
Oh,
Here you are. Here you are.
here.
Yeah.
I don't really have anything to add. I guess I'll say I see a lot of, looking through the gallery, I see a lot of young scholars on the call, and I know from the questions there are a lot of younger scholars who are thinking from places saturated with politics, as you say, and I think this, the question of post-colonial studies, not again, just as a kind of academic fad or branding thing. I think you are raising in a generous, respectful, thoughtful way. You have led us through so much of the work that epistemological critique has been able to do, but also how a certain kind of assumptions, frameworks, and binaries established by that work that are taken up uncritically may not be able to address many, as you and David Scott say, the demands of our political present. So I think this is an enormously important book on a lot of fronts, and I think and hope that a lot of the younger scholars here take this as an opening and a provocation, whether you agree or disagree, to kind of think with Fadi about these kinds of questions, including the status of a concept like emancipation for our downward spiraling world today. So thank you for putting that on the table in both very forceful, explicit, and sly, implicit ways.
Thank you, Gary, so much.
Well, I guess maybe I should then transfer my moderation to Ellen, the main host, and then we can.
Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you for a wonderful discussion of Fadi's book. Thank you for all of our guests. It was an amazing intervention that you made, each one of you. And Fadi, I really appreciate you helping put together this event.
Thank you, Ellen.
And thank you for all of our guests for being here.
Thank you, Fadi.
Thank you.
Ellen, Cemil, Griffin, fellow panelists.
Well, thank you all the
Thank you all.
participants.
Yes, and thank you so much, Griffin, for putting this together. He's the brilliance behind this, the entire thing.
That's Fadi.
No, that's you. Thank you, Griffin.
Thank you all.